"The Pasha of Rash burnt again," roared the Pasha of Rash, flinging his bowl of pudding across the table. "Vassals, varlets, villains, fetch forth the cook." At the Pasha's furious words, the two rash footmen who stood behind his chair took a running slide down the long dining hall and leaped through the door into the pantry. Several cups crashed against the door as it closed, so it is just as well that they hurried. As the Pasha reached for a large sauce dish, Ipti, the chief scribe of the realm, slipped quietly under the table, where he began jotting down in a little notebook each shocking remark about the pudding, making a huge blot whenever a plate broke or a cup splintered to fragments. He had to write pretty fast to keep up with the peppery little Pasha, and covered 3 pages with notes and blots by the time the footman returned with Hasha the cook shivering between them. "So!" wheezed the ruler of all the Rashes, puffing out his cheeks and glaring at the frightened little man. "Here you are." Choked the poor cook, falling upon his knees. "And may your excellency live forever, live forever," sputtered the Pasha, thumping the table with his fist, "on burnt puddings and raw roasts. It's a wonder I'm alive at all. Do you take me for an ostrich that you serve me lumps of charcoal and call it pudding? Are you a cook or a donkey?" At this, Ipti lifted a corner of the tablecloth and peered out to see what Hasha would say. Then, as the cook made no remark, he calmly wrote, "Donkey," closed the little book, and crept cautiously out from his hiding place. There were only 3 spoons left on the table, and he felt pretty sure that these would be flung at Hasha and not at him. He was perfectly right about this, and as the last one clattered down upon the head of the luckless cook, Hasha rose and, extending both arms, began tremulously, "I did not burn the pudding, Excellency. It was the fire." "The fire?" raged the Pasha, his eyes fairly popping with indignation. "Do you hear that, Ipti? He blames it on the fire. And who tends the fire, pray? Put him out. Fire him. Fizzin-pop, you old rascal, where are you?" "The fire shall be put out, and the cook shall be fired," muttered Ipti, flipping his book open and scribbling away industriously. This he could readily do, for the first finger of the scribe's right hand was a fountain pen, his second finger a long yellow pencil, his third finger an eraser, his little finger a stick of sealing wax, and his thumb a fat candle. Ipti's left hand was quite usual, except for the penknife that served him for a thumb. Blotting the last entry in the book with his cuff, which was neatly cut from blotting paper, he turned expectantly toward the door, just as Fizzin-Pop the Grand Vizier came hurtling through. Being Grand Vizier of Rash was no easy task, and Fizzin-Pop had grown thin and bald in the service of his country. "What now?" he gasped, pulling on his slipper and looking anxiously from one to the other. "Punish this pudding burner," commanded the Pasha angrily. "Put him in jail," chuckled Ipti. "In other words, you are to incarcerate the cook." The chief scribe loved long words and knew almost as many as the crossword puzzle makers. "But, your Highness," objected the Grand Vizier, pointing his long finger, "the prison is already overcrowded. Could we not cut off his—" Hasha looked imploringly at Fizzin-Pop, and the Grand Vizier, clearing his throat, finished hastily, "cut off his allowance instead." "No," thundered Irasha furiously. "I'll be peppered if I will. Prison is the place for him. Out of my sight, scullion." He waved contemptuously at the cook. "All right," sighed Fizzin-Pop. "I'll put him in the cell with your grand-uncle." The Pasha's grand-uncle had been flung into prison for beating the rash sovereign at chess. "But remember," warned the Grand Vizier, as Hasha was led disconsolately away by the guards, "remember there is not room for another person. Your Highness will have to find some other way to dispose of prisoners." "What can I do?" mumbled the Pasha, leaning sulkily on his elbow. "If you'd take my advice, you'd set them all free," said Fizzin-Pop calmly. "With half the population in prison, how do you expect to get any work done?" "Well, why don't they behave themselves, then?" demanded the Pasha fretfully. Fizzenpop sighed again, but made no further answer. What use to ask this wicked little ruler why he did not behave himself? Half the arrests in Rash were for no reason at all, and as you are probably puzzling about the location of this singular country, I must tell you that Rash is a small pink kingdom in the southwestern country of Ev, and directly across the deadly desert from the fairyland of Oz. The Rashes, it is true, are a hasty and hot-tempered race and always breaking out in spots, but they are warm-hearted and generous as well, and with just treatment and proper handling, as loyal subjects as a sovereign could ask for. But Arasha, the present Pasha, was neither just nor wise. He had seized the throne by treachery and was feared and hated by the entire Rash nation, so that one revolution followed another, and the realm was in a constant state of uproar. Again and again poor old Fizzenpop would make up his mind to retire, but feeling that he could serve his countrymen better by remaining, had stayed on, enduring the terrible tempers of the Pasha, and living for the day when the rightful ruler should be restored to the throne. "Well, why don't you say something?" growled Arasha, growing irritable at the long silence. "What do other countries do with their prisoners?" "Why not destroy them?" proposed Ipti cheerfully, before Fizzenpop had a chance to answer. The chief scribe was as cruel and merciless as his master. Arasha had discovered him in a Rash bookshop, where he was employed as clerk, and fascinated by his strange hands had raised him to his present important position. "In ancient countries," continued Ipti, sharpening the second finger of his right hand with the thumb of his left, "in ancient countries, prisoners were thrown to the wild beasts. Now I call that very neat. No fuss or worry, and practically no expense." Ipti closed his thumb with a pleased smile and looked brightly at the Pasha. "What?" shrieked Fizzenpop, stamping his foot furiously at the scribe. "Whoever would think of such a thing?" "I would," answered the Pasha calmly. "I think it's a very good plan, Ipti. But the trouble is," he paused and pushed back his spotted turban, "the trouble is we have no wild animals." "I wish I had a wild animal," sighed Arasha gloomily. "With the exception of a few speckled bears, there are no animals of any kind in Rash," and Fizzenpop had just drawn a long breath of relief when Ipti began again. "But there are plenty of wild animals in Oz, your Highness," suggested Ipti. "Why not send across the deadly desert and get a wild animal from Oz?" "Why not?" The Pasha straightened up in his chair and looked almost pleasant. "I believe I will," he mused thoughtfully. "An excellent notion, Ipti, for in that case we should not need a prison at all, and the expense of feeding the monster would be practically nothing." "And what's to prevent it from eating us?" demanded Fizzenpop explosively. Up to now he had been able to soften the lot of the Rash prisoners very considerably. He shuddered to think what would happen if Ipti's dreadful plan really were carried out. But Fizzenpop was too wise to openly oppose this rash pair, so he merely shrugged his shoulders. "Well," he sighed, folding his arms resignedly, "I hope it works out. I, myself, am too thin to worry, but this beast will probably consider you and Ipti choice morsels." He rolled his eyes sideways at the fat little Pasha and the still fatter scribe. "How will a wild animal know the difference between pashas and prisoners?" he inquired sarcastically. Arasha looked rather uncomfortable. "We'll have to get a civilized wild animal," he muttered uneasily. "An educated fellow who will eat whom we tell him to and obey the laws of the country." "And who ever heard of a civilized wild animal?" sniffed the Grand Vizier with a sour smile. "I have," declared Ipti, elevating his nose disagreeably. "There are any number of educated wild animals in the Emerald City of Oz. There's the cowardly lion, for instance, there's the comfortable camel and the doubtful dromedary, and there's the hungry tiger." "How about the hungry tiger?" asked Ipti triumphantly. "Hungry tiger?" Fizzenpop gave a gasp of dismay, for he had never even heard of such a creature. "Let's get the hungry tiger," yawned the Pasha, who was growing rather sleepy. "He'll be just the one for us." "But are you sure he's tame and harmless, Ipti, and safe to have about?" "Oh, quite," Ipti assured him quickly. "Why, he wouldn't hurt a baby. His conscience is so tender. That's why he's hungry, you know." "Then what makes you think he will eat the prisoners?" asked the Grand Vizier nervously. "Well," observed Ipti, scratching his ear with his fountain pen, "when this tiger realizes that it is perfectly legal and lawful to eat prisoners, I dare say he will jump at the chance, for in that way he can satisfy his appetite and his conscience at the same time. There are no criminals in the Emerald City, for Ozma, the queen, is a silly, soft-hearted little fairy and never arrests anyone, so the hungry tiger will be glad enough to come here and eat our prisoners." "Ipti is right," puffed the Pasha, rising stiffly from his chair. "Just take a hurricane from the stand there, and fetch back this hungry tiger, old fellow, and if he won't come, fetch him anyway." "Certainly, your highness," murmured the scribe, bowing low. "I will start for Oz at once." "You'll be sorry for this," panted Fizzenpop as the Pasha's pudgy figure disappeared down the pink passageway, and between anger and anxiety the Grand Vizier of Rash began to hop up and down like a jumping jack. "What are you dancing?" yawned Ipti. "A pepper jig." And brushing insolently past Fizzenpop, he lifted a hurricane from the stand and prepared to depart. First he lit his right thumb, for it was growing dark. Then he tore a page from his notebook and wrote, "Carry me to the Emerald City." Unscrewing the top, he thrust this paper carefully down into the head of the cane and screwed the head on again. He had just time to straighten his turban before the hurricane, with a whistle and crash, carried him clear out of the castle. Rushing to the window, Fizzenpop saw him straddling like some strange bird over Too Much Mountain. The flight of Ipti was not surprising to Fizzenpop, for hurry. Canes are one of the chief products of Rash, and are nearly always used for long journeys. No, it was not Ipti's departure that worried the old statesman. It was the thought of Ipti's return with the hungry tiger of Oz. How was he to save his poor prisoners from this dreadful beast? Pale with anxiety, he rushed into the Rash library and after some searching found what he was looking for: Professor Wogglebug's Encyclopedia of Oz. All his life, Fizzenpop had been so busy straightening out affairs in Rash he had had no time to study adjacent kingdoms at all, and knew little or nothing of the great fairyland that lay across the desert. Flipping over the pages of the encyclopedia to the T's, the Grand Vizier ran his finger down the list till he came to the hungry tiger. "This great and beautiful beast," stated the book shortly, "came to the Emerald City during the first year of Ozma's reign. He has been in all important processions and adventures since then, and is a great favorite with the celebrities of Oz. Because of his sociable nature, he prefers life in the capital to life in the jungle, and because of his tender conscience has never been known to devour a live man, fairy, or person." "Never been known to devour a live person?" shrilled Fizzenpop, dropping the encyclopedia with a bang. "Merciful mustard, what shall I do now?" Chapter 2. Betsy's Birthday. "Well," signed Betsy Bobbin, dropping into one of the royal hammocks and swinging her heels contentedly, "it was the best party I ever had." "I'm so full of birthday cake I feel like a sponge," groaned the Cowardly Lion, and sinking down on the grass he began to lick the frosting off his paws. "No wonder." "You had 10 pieces," grumbled the hungry tiger, settling down sulkily beside him. "Now I call that more than your share, old chap." "Why shouldn't I have the lion's share?" chuckled the great beast, winking at Betsy. "I notice you ate 3 roast ducks and all the plum pudding." "And still I am hungry," complained the tiger, rolling his eyes sadly from side to side. He looked so comical Betsy burst out laughing, and the Cowardly Lion fairly roared. Scraps, the patchwork girl, came running over to see what was the matter. All the celebrities had been invited to Betsy's party, and now, in the pleasant dusk, were walking about under the trees in the palace garden. Of all gardens in and out of the world there is none so lovely as Ozma's, and of all fairy cities there is none to compare with the Emerald City of Oz. Its sparkling buildings and shining streets, inlaid with emeralds, its quaint domed cottages and shimmering palace, make it a fitting capital for this enchanting fairyland. Where but in Oz can animals talk as sensibly as men? Where but in Oz can one live forever without growing old? Where but in Oz are there wishways and truth ponds, book mines and firefalls? And where but in Oz can one find such delightful companions as the Scarecrow and Scraps? Is it any wonder, then, that Dorothy Gale, who blew to Oz in a cyclone, that Trot and Betsy Bobbin, who arrived in this strange country by way of a shipwreck, have never returned to the real world? Who would? Who would? Indeed, these three little mortals live in the royal palace itself with Ozma, the young fairy who rules over the 4 countries of Oz, and this small sovereign has gathered at her court all the most interesting and unusual people and animals in the realm. And every single one had been invited to Betsy's birthday, so that it took 2 rooms to hold all the presents, 27 tables to seat the guests, and 69 footmen to pass the plates. "You sit there and tell me you're hungry," gasped Scraps, snapping her suspender-button eyes at the hungry tiger. "Why, you ate more than anyone," I counted. Scraps, being well stuffed with cotton, never ate at all and had amused herself by keeping strict watch over the others. "Why, Scraps," murmured Ozma reprovingly. She had come up behind the Patchwork Girl and now gently tried to change the subject. No one ever knew what Scraps would say next. Made from a gay patchwork quilt and magically brought to life, this saucy maiden was one of the most surprising people in the castle. But the hungry tiger had lived in the Emerald City too long to mind her teasing. "Of course I'm hungry," he yawned, rolling over on his side. "This party stuff fills me up but does not satisfy me. What I need is something alive." "But don't worry, my dear," he added hastily at Ozma's rather anxious expression. "I will never devour anyone, for my conscience would not permit it, so I shall be hungry to the end of my days." "Why don't you have yourself stuffed?" asked the Scarecrow, sitting down in the hammock beside Betsy Bobbin. "Then you would lose this frightful appetite and never be hungry at all." "Mighty convenient being stuffed, old boy. Saves no end of bother and expense." The Scarecrow spoke from experience, for he was himself a stuffed person, having been made by a Munchkin farmer and stuck on a pole to scare away the crows. He had been lifted down and brought to the Emerald City by Dorothy on her first adventure, and since then has been restuffed and laundered many times. Of all Ozma's advisers, he is the wittiest and most lovable. "Have yourself stuffed," he advised cheerfully, "and use straw like I do." "He stuffs himself from morning till night," snickered Scraps, turning a handspring. "If he were not so ugly, so yellow, and so big, I'd say he weren't a tiger, but a greedy weedy." "Scraps." Ozma raised her scepter warningly, and the Patchwork Girl dove into a button bush, but almost immediately her mischievous face reappeared. "Pig!" shouted Scraps defiantly, and looked so funny, peering out of the button bush, that even the hungry tiger had to grin. "I say, though, why don't you have yourself stuffed?" asked the little Wizard of Oz, who had just come up. "I've been experimenting with some new wishing powders and might easily wish you out of your jacket and stuff you with sawdust."
"Sawdust!"
coughed the hungry tiger, sitting up and lashing his tail at the very thought of such a thing. "I should say not. I prefer my own stuffing, thank you." "So do I," said Betsy, running over to give him a little hug. "You're so soft and comfortable to ride this way." "But sawdust is very serviceable," urged the wizard, who was anxious to try his new powders, "and I could stuff you in an hour." The wizard, by the way, is a mortal like Dorothy and Betsy. Long ago, he had been engaged by a circus in Omaha to make balloon flights. But one afternoon, his balloon, becoming unmanageable, had flown off, up and away, and never stopped till it dropped down in Oz. It was the wizard who had built the Emerald City, and for many years he practiced the trick magic he had learned in the circus. But later, Glinda, the good sorceress of the South, had taught him real magic, and he is now one of the most accomplished magicians in all fairy history. "Better let me stuff you," repeated the wizard coaxingly. "No, no, no," roared the hungry tiger, becoming really alarmed at the little man's persistence. "No, I tell you." "Well," the wizard rose regretfully and began to move off. "If you ever change your mind, let me have first chance, will you?" "I'm going to change my mind tomorrow." Sitting down stiffly on a bench opposite the hammock, Jack Pumpkinhead beamed upon the company. "It's almost too soft to use," mused Jack, touching the top of his pumpkin gently. "So if you don't mind, I'll not talk any more." "We don't mind at all," laughed Betsy, while Dorothy and Trot, who had just joined the group, exchanged merry winks. Jack was so amusing that no one could help chuckling when he was around. He had been made by Ozma when she was a little boy, and was almost as unusual as the Scarecrow. To those not familiar with Oz history, this may seem a bit strange, but Ozma once was a little boy, having been transformed by old Mombi the witch. And while she was a little boy, she had carved Jack neatly from wood and set an old pumpkin on his peg neck for a head. Later, he had been brought to life by mistake, and has been living merrily ever since. Every month or so, Jack has to pick a pumpkin and hollow out a new head for himself, so that he is constantly changing his mind. But Ozma has a deep affection for the queer fellow, and Jack is so odd and jolly that he is a great favorite in the Emerald City. "Let's finish off the party with a game of hide-and-seek," suggested the Cowardly Lion, as Jack continued to stare solemnly straight in front of him. "You're it, Betsy." Giving the little girl a playful poke, he dashed down an arbored path, followed helter-skelter by all the others. Even Jack, holding fast to his pumpkin head, ran and hid himself behind a balloon vine. But the hungry tiger ran fastest of all, never stopping till he reached the remotest corner of the garden. All this talk of stuffing had made him exceedingly nervous, and, with a troubled sigh, he sank down beside a lovely fairy fountain. Here, blinking up at the bright lanterns hung everywhere in honor of Betsy's birthday, he began to think of the good old days when he had roamed the wild jungles of Oz and eaten, well, we had best not say what he had eaten. It was the Cowardly Lion who had coaxed the hungry tiger to the capital. The Cowardly Lion himself had come there with Dorothy and the Scarecrow and grown so fond of the place and its people that he had returned to the jungle for his old friend, the Hungry Tiger. And like the Cowardly Lion, the Hungry Tiger had never been able to tear himself away from this dear and delightful city. Indeed, life without the love of Dorothy, Betsy, and Trot, the trust and affection of little Ozma, and the companionship of all the merry dwellers in the castle would not be worth a soup bone. So the hungry tiger had never gone back, but at times the longing for real tiger food almost overcame him. "I wonder if stuffing would help," sighed the poor beast, licking his chops hungrily. "I wonder—" "What?" wheezed an oily voice, almost in his ear. The hungry tiger, supposing himself to be alone, had spoken aloud, and springing up found himself face to face with an ugly, red-faced, and exceedingly disagreeable-looking stranger. He was dressed in robes of pink, gold-embroidered slippers and a simply enormous turban that wagged from side to side as he talked. An oddly twisted cane swung from his left wrist, and as he extended his hand in greeting, the hungry tiger jumped back in alarm, for the stranger's thumb was blazing away merrily. It was Ipti, chief scribe of Rash, for the hurricane had brought him straight to the royal gardens of the Emerald City of Oz. Am I addressing the Hungry Tiger of Oz? Inquired Ipti. And are you still hungry? He asked eagerly. What if I am? Growled the Hungry Tiger, blinking suspiciously at Irasha's singular messenger. What if I am? Come with me, said Ipti mysteriously. Come with me, famous and famished member of the feline family, and you will never know hunger more. Who are you? Rumbled the Hungry Tiger, sitting up and beginning to pant a little from astonishment. Who are you, and what are you doing here? I am Ipti, chief scribe of Irasha the Rough, and I am here to offer you an important position at the court of Rash. Come to Rash, begged Ipti, glancing uneasily over his shoulder, for he was not anxious to meet any of the Oz celebrities. Come, before we are discovered. Rash, coughed the Hungry Tiger impatiently. Why should I go to that measly little kingdom when I am perfectly happy and contented here? Because, bending over and splattering the Hungry Tiger with hot candle grease from his thumb, Ipti began whispering earnestly in his ear. At first, the Hungry Tiger's tail lashed and twirled with fury, but as Ipti continued, he grew calmer, and a queer longing crept into his great yellow eyes. Stand back, fellow, he mumbled crossly. You will singe off my whiskers, and kindly remove your pencil from my eye. But you will come? Straightening up, Ipti put his bristly hand behind him and regarded the Hungry Tiger expectantly. Not less than 1 prisoner a day, sometimes as many as 10, he repeated persuasively. Humph, grunted the tiger, half closing his eyes. Already Ipti's wicked plan was beginning to tempt him. Surely eating criminals would not be wrong, or at least not so very wrong. And these prisoners are dangerous fellows, I suppose? He asked casually, trying to appear careless and unconcerned about the whole queer business. Villains, thieves, and robbers, rascally fat rogues who are a menace to the country. By eating them you will be doing Rash a real service, Ipti assured him. And where is Rash? Asked the Hungry Tiger, waving his tail inquiringly. In the southwestern corner of Ev, answered the scribe, with a wave that nearly put out his thumb. And if you are ready, dear beast, we will start at once. Ev, spluttered the tiger. Why, that's miles away. I was there long ago when Ozma, Dorothy, and Billina rescued Prince Ivardo from the Gnome King. Too far, yawned the Hungry Tiger, rolling over on the dewy grass. I'm too tired for such a journey. No trip at all. Ipti touched the hurricane and in a few words explained its curious mechanism, following it up with such a tempting description of the Rash prisoners that the Hungry Tiger's appetite got the better of his conscience. I'll go, he agreed gruffly, but only for a few days, remember? Ipti said nothing but smiled wickedly to himself. Then, stuffing the directions for their return into the hurricane, he sprang upon the Hungry Tiger's back. Next instant, in a flash of fire and smoke, they had disappeared from the garden. What was that? Gasped Dorothy, clutching Ozma by the sleeve. Both little girls, crouched behind a button bush, had seen the strange flash. Lightning, I guess, shuddered Ozma. Let's run back to the castle, Dorothy. A thunderstorm's coming. Chapter 3. The Hungry Tiger in Rash. It was night time when Ipti and the Hungry Tiger arrived at the Pink Palace. Traveling by hurricane is a hair-raising experience, let me tell you. Showing the breathless beast to a luxurious apartment, the chief scribe hurried off to the Pasha, and until long after midnight the two whispered and conferred together. Of course it was about the Hungry Tiger that they talked. A saucy but serviceable brute, finished Ipti, blowing out his thumb. And he will require watching, your highness, for would not a tiger fed on criminals grow dangerous? We'll lock him up in the prison courtyard, declared Irashi, rubbing his hands gleefully together. Then there'll be no chance of his running away or chewing off our heads. Good work, old Buttertub. I'll raise your wages for this. and clapping his chief scribe on the back, Irashi tumbled into bed and was soon snoring loudly. The hungry tiger did not find falling asleep so easy. Already he regretted his rash action in coming with Ipti. Padding up and down the big bedroom, he began anxiously to reflect upon the duties of his new office. Was it right or wrong to eat the rash criminals? What would Ozma think if she knew? The gentle face of the little fairy kept rising reproachfully between him and the thought of the fat and tempting prisoners. "I'll stay just a few days," groaned the poor tiger at last, trying to put Ozma out of his mind, "and only eat the very worst and wickedest ones. I hope they'll not taste too bad," he yawned, sinking down wearily on the soft pink rug, "nor have too many knives and swords in their pockets. Ah, oh, hum." With a great yawn, the tired tiger rolled over and fell into a troubled sleep. A shrill blast of trumpets wakened him next morning, and a few moments later Ipti came to conduct him to the Pasha. Irashi had craftily arranged to receive the hungry tiger in the prison courtyard, and surrounded by the rash guardsmen with Fizzenpop standing anxiously at his side, he waited for the tiger to appear. The walk from the palace to the prison was not long, but it gave the hungry tiger quite a glimpse of the country and the people. The palace and all of the cottages and stores were of pink stone. Pink trees lined the pink marble walks, and even the sky had a rosy glow. The rashers themselves, hurrying to and fro in their tremendous flapping turbans, oddly quilted robes and soft pink slippers, seemed pleasant enough fellows, and again the hungry tiger's conscience began to trouble him. But it was too late to turn back now, so he stalked uncomfortably after Ipti. The prison itself looked quite like a wing of the Pink Palace, and unsuspectingly the hungry tiger passed through the great golden gates and into a high-walled court. "Aha!" exclaimed Irashi, as he advanced majestically to the center of the courtyard. "So here he is at last, the famous and famished Tiger of Oz. And in uniform, too. Is it not splendid that the future jailer of Rash should wear stripes?" chuckled the Pasha, poking Fizzenpop playfully in the ribs. "Even now our prisoners will go behind the bars after they are eaten," he whispered hoarsely, fearing Fizzenpop might not get the joke. Ipti burst into a loud roar, but the Grand Vizier, after one look at the huge figure of the tiger, began to tremble from top to toe. The hungry tiger himself was not at all pleased with his reception. "Are you laughing at me?" he growled, lashing his tail and showing so many teeth the rash guardsmen took to their pink heels. "Are you laughing at M.E.?" "No, no, certainly not," grunted Irashi, moving hurriedly toward the gates. "I hope you will be most comfortable and happy here." At each word Irashi took a great leap, followed closely by Ipti and Fizzenpop. By the time he finished his sentence and before the hungry tiger realized what was happening, all three were on the other side of the gates, and the tiger himself was locked fast in the courtyard. "Stay there, you saucy monster," puffed Irashi, shaking his scepter playfully, and taking Fizzenpop by one arm and Ipti by the other, he waddled off, leaving the hungry tiger to reflect upon his folly. Ran round and round the prison yard, examining every inch of the high walls. But it was useless. There was not so much as a chink in the marble blocks. Raging with anger at Irashi and disgusted with himself for being so easily caught, he crouched down in a gloomy corner of the yard to think. All choice in the matter of eating the rash prisoners was now removed, for, as he sadly reflected, there would probably be nothing else to eat. But eating prisoners when you are free and happy, and eating prisoners because there is nothing else, are entirely different matters, and already half the pleasure was gone from the experiment. How was he to escape from this miserable little monarch? Would Dorothy and Betsy miss him? Why, oh why, had he not listened to the voice of his conscience, or even had himself stuffed, as the wizard suggested? Blinking his eyes mournfully, the hungry tiger began to feel sorry not only for the rash prisoners, but dreadfully sorry for himself, for was he not a prisoner too? He had plenty of time to feel sorry, for not a soul came near him all day, not even a rash mouse. There was a tub of water in the corner of the yard, but nothing to eat, and as the shadows grew longer and longer, the poor tiger grew hungrier and hungrier. Betsy's party seemed years ago, and when, toward evening, shrill screams from the wall announced the approach of Irashi and the guards, he looked up almost hopefully to see whether they were bringing a prisoner. They were. Propped up between two guards, and advancing most unwillingly, was a tall, turbaned figure. "Here," shouted Irashi, leaning far over the wall. "Here is your supper. Eat this rogue at once." "He has wakened me from my sacred nap with his horrible howling." "I suppose I'll have to," mumbled the hungry tiger uncomfortably to himself, and growling to keep his courage up and his conscience down, he advanced toward the wall just as the guardsman dropped the luckless rasher over. He landed lightly on the balls of his feet, and after one look at the hungry tiger, pulled his turban over his eyes and began to screech with terror. "Eat him up! Shut him up!" "What's the matter? Have you no teeth?" bawled Irashi, covering his ears. "I never dine till 10 o'clock," answered the hungry tiger stiffly. He was not going to be bullied by the wretched little sovereign of Rash. "And I never eat until I am alone," he growled, raising his roar above the wails of the prisoner. "Suit yourself," grumbled Irashi, but secretly he was disappointed. To watch the hungry tiger devour the prisoner would have been a real treat for the wicked little pasha. Covering both ears to drown the poor fellow's doleful yells, he scrambled down the steps on the other side of the wall. "We'll return later to see if he is eaten," puffed the little pasha, turning back toward the castle, and the guardsmen, exchanging uneasy glances, clanked after him. As soon as they were alone, the hungry tiger approached the prisoner. "Would you mind stopping that noise?" he begged earnestly. "You're really spoiling my supper." "Your supper?" gulped the rasher, trembling violently. "Do you expect me to submit to eating without a sound?" "Well, I wish that you would," sighed the tiger hopefully. "I never cared for music with my meals. Now don't be frightened. I won't hurt you much. If you were not so tall, I'd swallow you whole." "Oh," groaned the prisoner, falling upon his knees, "have you no heart, no conscience? Are you really cruel enough to devour a poor fellow like me?" At each word, the hungry tiger recoiled a bit further. "But what can I do? I've nothing else to eat, and it is the rash law that you should perish." "By the way, what was your crime?" he asked sadly. Now that the time for eating a live man was at hand, he found himself curiously disturbed. "I'm a singer," began the prisoner in a choked and frightened voice. "This afternoon, hoping to earn a few rash pence, I stopped beneath the palace balcony and, straightening up and throwing out his chest, the singer burst into tears and song, mingling them so thoroughly the hungry tiger was soon crying like a baby himself. Without the tears, the song went something like this. "Oh, why must lovely roses die? Oh, why, sniff, sniff, oh, why, say why? Oh, why must hay be cut and mown in its first heyday? Groan, sniff, groan. And why must grass be trodden down, and trees cut up to build a town? Should little lambs grow into chops and hang around in butcher shops? No, no, I weep, it is too sad. Sniff, snuffle, sniff, I feel so sad." "So do I," roared the hungry tiger. "Stop, stop, I am positively ill." "What's that?" That was a large bunch of bananas. It came whistling over the wall, followed by 3 onions, a sausage, a squash pie, and a head of cabbage. "They always throw things when I sing," sobbed the singer, drying his eyes on his pink sleeve. "Pass me that sausage," gulped the hungry tiger in a faint voice. "Aren't you going to eat me?" stuttered the sad singer, offering the sausage fearfully and jumping back as if he expected the tiger to snap off his arm. between bites, and the sausage took only 2. The hungry tiger shook his head. "Not now," he answered wearily. "I might have swallowed you, but that song, never. A man full of music like that would ruin my digestion. How's the pie?" "Squashed," said the singer in a depressed whisper. "Try the onions." He held them out hopefully, but the hungry tiger only shuddered. "Eat them yourself," he advised gloomily. "You seem to enjoy crying." Reaching for a banana, the hungry tiger ripped off the skin and swallowed it whole. 3 more he treated in the same reckless fashion. Then, licking his whiskers, he regarded the sad singer reproachfully. "You may go now," he said gruffly. "Your singing is outrageous, but you are neither wicked enough to satisfy my conscience nor fat enough to satisfy my appetite. Go, 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 before—" "But how can I go?" moaned the singer, waving despairingly at the high walls. I do not know whether his tears were from grief, gratitude, or onions. He had eaten all 3 by this time. "Well, you can't stay here," rumbled the tiger anxiously, "for you're supposed to be eaten." "I'll hide," muttered the prisoner, glaring around wildly. But there was no place in the whole pink yard where he could conceal himself. Round and round tore the worried rasher, and round after him nosed the hungry tiger, and, just as the moon rose up over the pink turrets of the palace, they discovered a loose block in the stone pavings. Scratching frantically with his powerful claws, the hungry tiger managed to dig up the whole block, and dragging it aside, found a small, damp underground chamber. The sad singer was overjoyed when he peeped into the dark hole, for he had become very nervous in his fear that the tiger would soon decide to eat him. To tell the truth, the hungry tiger was glad himself. The sad singer did not look very good to eat. "There!" grunted the hungry tiger, thrusting the singer in and throwing some bananas and a head of cabbage after him. "Be quiet, and whatever you do, don't sing." He had just pushed the block back, leaving a small crevice to give the prisoner air, when Irashi and Ipti appeared upon the wall. "Ah, he has eaten him!" cried Irashi rapturously, and clapping his hands like a child, he began to address the hungry tiger in most affectionate terms, promising him 12 prisoners upon the morrow. But the hungry tiger merely turned his back and gazed solemnly up at the moon. And seeing nothing was to be got out of him, Irashi and his wicked scribe tiptoed off to bed, well pleased with the new jailer of Rash. The hungry tiger himself, in spite of a horribly hollow feeling, what is a sausage and 4 bananas to a tiger, soon fell asleep. And perhaps because he had done nothing to trouble his kind old conscience, he dreamed that he was safely back in the Emerald City with dear little Ozma of Oz. Chapter 4. The Vegetable Man of Oz. We shall have to leave the poor hungry tiger in the jail yard of Rash and take a peep at what is going on in the Emerald City of Oz. It will be something exciting, I am sure. One never can guess what will happen next in the fairyland of Oz. Red ripe tomatoes. Red ripe tomatoes, fresh strawberries, fresh strawberries. Ripe red tomatoes, fine new potatoes, salad, cress, and peas, fresh strawberries. "Strawberries!" exclaimed Betsy Bobbin in delight, and running to the palace window, looked up and down the garden to see where the voice was coming from. It was so like old times in the States it made Betsy homesick. "Why, I never heard a huckster calling around here before," thought Betsy. "I believe I'll buy some for breakfast and surprise Ozma." Fastening the last button on her blue frock, she skipped out of the room, down the stairs, and into the garden, following the sound of the husky voice. Sometimes it seemed to be quite near, at other times to come drifting back to her from a great distance, and before long Betsy was perfectly breathless from darting to and fro. But at last a sharp turn in the path brought her right upon the owner of the voice. It was a vegetable man, sure enough, his small hand-cart piled high with fresh greens and rosy strawberries. "I'll take a box of berries, please," panted Betsy, and standing on her tiptoes, she pointed to a very large and tempting one. "Certainly, miss," said the vegetable man, and handing her the box, stood smiling and bowing in the roadway. But instead of taking it, Betsy gasped and put both hands behind her. "Now don't be scared," said the vegetable man softly. "I know I'm an odd one, but you'll get used to me." "Try to get used to me," he begged coaxingly. Betsy thought it would take a long time, but he seemed so earnest that she took a long breath and looked at him again. His face was red and smooth as a beet. Queer root-like whiskers sprouted raggedly from the bottom. Curious celery-leaf hair waved excitedly from the top, while a turnip nose and two tall corn ears gave him a most roguish and inquisitive expression. His body was more like an enormous potato than anything else, and his arms and legs were long, wiry roots of some coarse vegetable fiber. "Well?" asked the vegetable man anxiously, as Betsy finished her inspection. "Can you stand me at all?" I think you're pretty interesting," confessed Betsy, who was an exceedingly polite and kind-hearted little girl. "Am I?" beamed the stranger, rubbing his twig-like hands together. "Well, well, I'm glad to hear you say that, for it's just what I've been thinking myself. But I was not always like this, my dear." The vegetable man's blue eyes were the only natural feature about him, and they twinkled so merrily above his turnip nose that Betsy began to feel quite drawn to him. "I was a Winkie," he confided mysteriously, "and sold fresh vegetables to all the royal families in Oz. But each night when I returned to my farm there were vegetables left in my cart, so young, so fresh, so fair, I could not let them die, so I ate them," he continued dreamily. "And bit by bit I turned to the figure you see before you. But I'm quite used to myself now and can still carry on my business. In fact, spinach!" The vegetable man interrupted himself crossly. "Spinach and rhubarb. Why, what's the matter?" asked Betsy in surprise, for he had put down the strawberries and was tugging with all his might at his left foot, which presently came up so violently he sat down hard in the road. "Would you mind walking on as we converse?" puffed the vegetable man, picking up the box of berries and springing nimbly to his feet. "I take root if I stand still," he said apologetically. "It would be awfully inconvenient to become rooted to this spot, and there's no telling what I'd grow into." "Why don't you wear shoes?" asked Betsy, trotting along beside the cart and almost forgetting about the strawberries in her extreme interest. "I never thought of that," mused the vegetable man, looking down ruefully at his huge twisted feet. "Do you suppose I could ever find any shoes to fit, miss? Miss, what is your name now?" "Mine's Green, Carter Green, but most folks call me Carter." "Mine's Betsy Bobbin, but I think I'd better go back now or I'll be late for breakfast." Stopping reluctantly, Betsy reached for her box of berries, and as she had brought no money, she slipped a small emerald ring into the vegetable man's hand. At first he refused to take it, but as the little girl insisted and assured him she had dozens more like it, Carter slipped the ring into the leather pouch he wore round his neck. "I've a stone, something like this," he told her, and, hopping up and down to keep from taking root, he fumbled in the pouch till he brought out a large square ruby. "Found it in a potato," continued Carter as Betsy turned it over and over in her hand. "Not in any. I raised myself, but in one of a lot I bought from a gypsy. Like it?" Betsy nodded emphatically, for not even in Ozma's crown itself had she seen a more dazzling jewel. There was a small R cut in one of the flat sides of the gem, and the ruby itself blazed and sparkled in the sunshine and fairly made Betsy blink. "But I wonder what the R stands for," she murmured softly. "Raspberries, I guess," chuckled the vegetable man, putting the ruby back into his pouch. "Raspberries, rhubarb, or radishes." "Have a radish, my dear Miss Betsy." "Oh, no, thank you, and I really must go now." Holding the strawberries carefully, Betsy smiled up into the pleasant face of Mr. Carter Green. He was so curious and exciting she hated to leave him, but Dorothy and Ozma would surely think her lost, so with a little skip she turned about. "Don't forget the shoes," she reminded him gaily. "Goodbye. Good gracious. Hold tight, Betsy, hold tight. Celery and cinnamon. What's the matter here?" Seizing his cart with one hand and the little girl with the other, the vegetable man teetered backward and forward in the road, and no wonder! It had suddenly ripped itself loose and was rushing along at such a rate that trees and fences simply whizzed past. Betsy's hat blew off at the first curve, and strawberries, beets, and bananas flew out in every direction. "I was afraid of this," panted the vegetable man. "I should have taken the regular road. "Isn't this a regular road?" called Betsy, hanging on to Carter with both hands. "What's it doing?" "Winding!" shrieked the vegetable man, trying to keep the rest of his vegetables from bouncing out of the cart. "It's a winding road. Betsy, shut your eyes quick." Betsy was glad enough to obey, for the road was going round like a top, round and round like a merry-go-round, in and out of trees, past lakes and forests, till the whole world tilted topsy-turvy. Then, as suddenly as it had started to wind, it stopped, and when Betsy opened her eyes, she was sitting on a small sand dune entirely surrounded by cabbages. A short distance away lay the vegetable man, still clutching his cart. While Betsy was still trying to catch her breath, Carter jumped up and, shading his eyes, looked in all directions. "Well, it's gone!" he exclaimed ruefully, and he was perfectly right. There was no sign of a road anywhere. It had cruelly gone off and left them in a wilderness of sand and scorched desert grass. "Why, I never knew there was a winding road near the Emerald City!" Betsy jumped up indignantly. "Where did it come from?" "Never can tell," sighed the vegetable man, beginning to collect his cabbages. "They just come and go, these winding roads of Oz, pass themselves off as regular roads till they catch a few travelers, and you never can tell where they will take you." "Well, I don't think much of this place," groaned Betsy, rubbing her elbow, which had been severely skinned during the journey over the winding road. "Then let's go some other place," proposed the vegetable man cheerfully. All the strawberries and bananas had spilled out of the cart, but there were plenty of cabbages and apples left, and he was busily rearranging these all the time he was talking to Betsy. "Have a cabbage?" he invited pleasantly. "Nothing like cabbages for a shipwreck." "It was something like a shipwreck," mused Betsy thoughtfully. "But I'd rather have an apple, if you don't mind. Do you think we'll ever find the way back to the Emerald City, Mr. Green?" Carter nodded so vigorously his celery tops waved for moments afterward, and, handing Betsy an apple, he pointed off toward the south. "It's somewhere in that direction, and if you're ready, we'd better start." Carter looked a little anxiously at his feet to see if he was taking root, but the ground was too dry and sandy. "I don't believe even I would grow in this kind of soil," he muttered uneasily. "It's hot enough to scorch a fellow. Wish I had a pair of shoes right now. Come, let's move on." Lifting Betsy on top of the cabbages, the vegetable man grasped the handles of his cart and started on a run across the sandy wasteland. It was not unpleasant, rattling along in the queer little cart, and the morning was so brisk and fine, Betsy soon began to enjoy herself. "Won't Dorothy and Ozma be surprised when I come rolling up to the castle in this?" she chuckled merrily to herself. "And won't they stare when I introduce the vegetable man? Why, he's almost as interesting as Tick-Tock and more fun. I wonder if everybody who eats too many vegetables grows celery tops and corn ears. Oh, Mr. Green, Mr. Gran. But the cartwheels were going round with such a squeak, grind, and rattle that he did not hear her, and Betsy sensibly decided to save this important question for another time. She had just finished her second apple when the vegetable man stopped with a jerk. A rude sign stuck up in the limb of a crooked tree had caught his attention. "Quicksand," said the sign. "Go slow." "Oh, spinach!" exclaimed the vegetable man, wiping his face on a stray salad leaf. "Oh, spinach, do you suppose it's very quicksand?" asked Betsy, leaning far over the side of the cart. "We'll soon find that out." Taking an apple, Carter flung it as far as he could, but horrors! No sooner had it touched the sand than it disappeared as suddenly as one drop of dew on a frying pan. "It's a good thing you stopped," shuddered Betsy, "or we'd have been swallowed up." "Down," corrected Carter gloomily. "Looks like pretty quicksand to me, Betsy. Guess we'll have to turn back." Mournfully, Carter began bringing the cart about. The way they had come was so rough and uneven that he hated the thought of traveling over it again.
"But that won't take us to the Emerald City,"
objected Betsy, beginning to grow a little anxious. "Maybe we could find a path if we looked carefully enough." Jumping out of the cart, Betsy climbed a small dune. But as far as the eye could reach, there was nothing but sand. Sand, 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 shimmering dizzily in the sunlight, with not a tree, path, or even a blade of grass to break the monotony. With a sigh, Betsy started down the dune. She had gone about halfway when a big, newspaper-wrapped package made her pause. It was covered with a queer writing that she could not understand, but looked so interesting she hastily shook it open. Imagine her astonishment when a huge pair of sandals tumbled out. They were cut from white leather, had silver buckles, and were almost large enough for a giant.
"Why, I believe they'd fit Carter," murmured Betsy in pleased surprise. "How lucky I found them."
Gathering the sandals up in her arms, she ran down to the vegetable man. He was almost as pleased as she was, for the trip across the dry desert had already begun to curl up his toes, and, while she climbed back into the cart, he sat down to try them on. They were a bit long, but just the right width, and as he fastened the first one, he noticed 2 words cut into the buckle. "Quick, sandals," murmured Carter under his breath. "Now what may that mean?" But he was in such a hurry to be off, he did not stop to puzzle it out, and drawing on the other sandal, jumped excitedly to his feet. "Now I won't be taking root," he cried joyfully. "Now." A strange look came into his mild blue eyes, and next instant he had sprung into the air like a jackrabbit. "Help!" screamed the vegetable man. "Spinach, tomatoes, turnips, and cress." And while Betsy stared at him in dismay and growing alarm, he sprang twice as high as he had in the first place, seized the handles of the cart, and started on a gallop for the quicksand. Oh, stop, wailed the little girl frantically. "Stop, Carter, stop!" But he paid not the smallest attention to her. Now they were on the quicksand itself, and Betsy, with a scream, buried her face in the cabbages. But the rattle and bump of the cart continued, and, concluding that she could not be swallowed up yet, she ventured to raise her head. What she saw this time was so much worse that she had not even courage to cry, "Stop!" They had crossed the quicksand and were right on the edge of the deadly desert. Betsy well knew the look of this dread wilderness that surrounds the fairyland of Oz, and she knew also that contact with its burning sands meant instant destruction. She tried to signal to the vegetable man, but the cart was bumping and bouncing so terribly, it was all she could do to keep from falling out. Carter himself was running as if his life depended upon it, his celery tops waving wildly and his corn ears rustling in the wind. With a choked sob, poor little Betsy shut her eyes and dropped face down among the vegetables. Chapter 5. Prisoners in Rash Betsy never had been destroyed in her life, so she was not at all sure how it would feel. A hot, dry wind whistled through her hair, and above the rumble of the wheels she could hear the sharp gasps of Carter Green. Then everything stopped at once. The cart, the burning wind, and the hoarse breathing of the vegetable man.
"He's destroyed!"
cried Betsy despairingly.
"And now it's my turn!"
Closing her eyes and trying hard to be brave, Betsy waited for destruction. But nothing at all happened, and after a few terrible moments she sat up and peered timidly around her. On a pink milestone beside the cart sat the vegetable man, staring across the deadly desert. Following his startled gaze, Betsy saw two white objects skipping merrily toward the skyline. It was the sandals. Just as she had made sure of it, they disappeared in a final spurt of speed and sand.
Why, how did they get off?
Stammered Betsy, blinking with astonishment.
Took themselves,
groaned the vegetable man, rubbing his shins, and glad I am that they did. But they've brought us safely across the quicksand and deadly desert, and here we are.
Yes, agreed Betsy resignedly. Here we are, but where are we?
I didn't know they were quicksandals. Did they really run away with you? Carter nodded and rose stiffly to his feet. I must say, Betsy, grunted the vegetable man, I prefer to run myself and not be carried off by a frisky pair of shoes. After this I'll do my own kicking, my own stopping, and my own starting, thank you, and we'd better start right away or everything will be spoiled. He looked anxiously into the cart and, jumping out, Betsy began to help him dust and rearrange the vegetables. They had been sadly jolted about by the trip. As it was impossible to go back across the desert without the quicksandals, they sensibly decided to go forward. There were two roads, stretching invitingly ahead, and after a short debate they took the left one. This reminds me a little of the Rose Kingdom, mused Betsy, as they walked along under the flowering trees. Everything is pink, Carter, have you noticed? Even the clouds. Why, there's a pink castle, cried Carter with an excited wave. Maybe we can sell the king of this country some cabbages, and maybe he can tell us the way back to the Emerald City.
Perhaps we'd better try some of the cottages first,
suggested Betsy uneasily. In her many adventures she had discovered that kings were not always safe nor agreeable persons to deal with.
No, no,
insisted Carter. Kings make the best customers, Betsy. Compliment and flatter 'em and sell 'em the whole cartload. That's my way. Jump in and I'll run you right up to the castle. Lifting her gaily into the cart, he started briskly down the pink lane, calling, "Cabbages, fresh cabbages," at the top of his vegetable voice. The lane led straight into a bright pink city, and Betsy soon grew so interested in its tall turbaned citizens and queer cottages and shops that she forgot to worry about the king. She remembered afterward the scared glances of some of the townsmen as they went rattling by, but at the time neither she nor Carter noticed anything amiss, and the vegetable man never stopped till he reached the pink palace itself. As Carter paused under a balcony and began lustily calling his wares, a window just below was flung up violently and a turbaned head wagged warningly over the sill. "Go away! Go away!" quavered an old man in a frightened voice. "The Pasha is in a terrible temper. Go away, rash mortals, I beg of you." But the vegetable man only laughed. "Wait till he's seen my cabbages," called Carter, holding one up proudly. Wait. And they did not have long to wait, let me tell you, for at that precise moment the Pasha of Rash rushed out upon the balcony. The Pasha himself and Ipti, chief scribe of the realm, for Betsy and the vegetable man had, as you have probably guessed already, run straight into that peppery country. "Good morning," cried Carter pleasantly, in no wise alarmed by the fearful frown of the rash ruler. "Permit me to observe that your highness is beautiful as a banana and fragrant as an onion. And I am here to serve you. Let me serve your majesty with a fresh young cauliflower, a bunch of beets, or this handsome cabbage." Carter held up the cabbage coaxingly. A cabbage, choked Irashi, turning perfectly pink with passion. "How dare you offer me a cabbage?" So angry that further speech was impossible, he turned furiously to Ipti, waving his arms and sputtering like a motorcycle. "Begone, pernicious peddlers," ordered the chief scribe, pointing his fountain pen finger sternly at the two travelers. "Begone at once from Rash." 3 drops of ink fell upon Betsy's upturned nose, and, thoroughly alarmed, the little girl sprang out of the cart and tried to pull Carter away. Hurry up, she begged breathlessly. "Let's run." But already the vegetable man had tarried too long and was firmly rooted to the spot. And while he tugged wildly at one foot and then the other, and Betsy jumped up and down with fright and impatience, Ipty leaned over the balcony. A closer inspection of the vegetable man proved so astonishing to the chief scribe that he nearly fell over the railing. "He has corn ears," yelled Ipty shrilly, "and a turnip nose. Look, look at the monstrous creature." Thus urged, Irashi himself peered over the railing. Perceiving in a moment what had happened to Carter, he began to stamp and shriek with anger. "How dare you plant your feet in my best flower beds?" howled Irashi. "Call out the guards. Throw them to the tiger. Salt, vinegar, mustard, pepper." At each shriek a rash guardsman dashed out of the palace, and before Carter could jerk himself loose, he and Betsy were overpowered.
"He can't help taking root," protested Betsy indignantly. "He's a vegetable man."
"Aha, now we are getting to the root of the matter," snickered Ipty harshly. "And what right has a vegetable man in Rash, young lady? Root him up, throw him to the tiger." Vegetable man indeed," roared Irashi, stamping one foot and then the other. "Tiger," groaned Carter. "How perfectly carnivorous." "Of course," he added, turning quickly to Betsy. "It wouldn't hurt me, for I have no feelings, but it will ruin my business. Spare me," he cried, waving his arms imploringly up at the balcony. "And if you cannot spare me, spare my potatoes, my cabbages, and fresh young beets, and spare this lovely little lady from Oz." "We'll spare you, all right," wheezed Irashi grimly. "He'd make excellent soup, your highness," suggested Ipty, glancing down sideways at the vegetable man, but Irashi shook his head. "No, no, the tiger shall have him," declared Irashi stubbornly. "It'll be a nice change for him, Ipty, a little green with his dinner." Irashi was so pleased with his joke that he winked down at Betsy, but the little girl stamped her foot angrily. "You'd better let us go, or Ozma of Oz will capture your whole kingdom."
"We're important people back in Oz,"
shouted Betsy defiantly. "Perhaps the girl is right," ventured Fizzenpop, who had stolen anxiously out upon the balcony. "What harm have they done? Let them go, I beg." "No!" With a determined wag of his turban, Irashi signaled to the guard and flounced back into the palace. "Don't cry, Betsy," begged the vegetable man. The guards had at last jerked him loose and were marching the two across the gardens. "This tiger will probably eat me first, and I'm so tough he'll choke to death and you can run away."
"Well, I wish I had never found those quick sandals," wailed the little girl. "It was the quick sandals that brought us here, Carter, and I don't believe Ozma knows about this dreadful country at all." "Couldn't you please let us go, Mr. Pepper?" she begged tearfully of the guard. The tall rasher looked down at her doubtfully, but Salt, who had hold of Carter and was just behind, shook his turban violently. "If we fail to obey the Pasha, we ourselves will be thrown to this tiger," sputtered Salt grimly. "That's right," chimed in Vinegar and Mustard, who were bringing up the procession with the vegetable man's cart. "Let's hurry through with it." And turning a deaf ear to the pleas of the prisoners, the rash guardsmen rushed them across the lawn, up the steep steps, and threw them over the prison wall. Then, without one backward glance, they marched off to the palace. Too breathless to run, Betsy picked herself up and looked fearfully around for the tiger. There he was, and growling frightfully, for the vegetable cart and all the vegetables had hit him on the head, slashing right and left and shaking himself so violently that potatoes, beets, and apples flew in every direction. He rose and started toward her. This, after all the other frightful happenings of the morning, was too much, and covering her face, Betsy burst into tears. But if Betsy was frightened, the hungry tiger was perfectly petrified. "Betsy, Betsy," panted the astonished beast, "how in Oz did you get here?" And rubbing his soft nose against her cheek, he began to dry her tears with his tongue. At the first sound of that familiar voice, Betsy's eyes flew open, and next instant she had both arms round the hungry tiger's neck, hugging him for dear life. "Carter! Carter!" called the little girl excitedly. "Don't be scared. It's the Hungry Tiger of Oz." She fairly sang out the name in her relief and happiness. The vegetable man had dropped head first into the tiger's tub of water. At Betsy's cries, he made a valiant attempt to rise, but when he saw her actually embracing the tiger, he was so startled and horrified that he fell back with a splash. "Hungry tiger!" gurgled Carter, bobbing up and down like a cork. "Hungry tiger. Then so much the worse for us." Chapter 6. The Scarlet Prince. "Would you mind not using my drinking cup for a bath?" observed the hungry tiger mildly, as Carter continued to gurgle and splash about in the tub. Laughing with relief, Betsy seized the vegetable man's hands and pulled him out of the water. "Don't be scared," whispered Betsy comfortably. "This tiger's a friend of mine, and he wouldn't hurt anybody." "Then what's he doing here?" asked Carter accusingly. "Is this Parsnippy Pasha his friend, too?" The hungry tiger winced guiltily at Betsy's kind little speech, but resolved that she should never know he had willingly come to Rash. "I'm his prisoner," he explained in a hollow voice. And indeed he was terribly hollow by this time. "I'm a prisoner like yourselves." In a husky roar, he told of his trip by hurricane to Irashi's kingdom and of his imprisonment in the Rash courtyard. "So this light-fingered Ipti brought you here," mused Carter wonderingly. "But why?" "To eat the Rash prisoners," answered the hungry tiger faintly. "And have you eaten any?" Betsy regarded her old friend anxiously. "Well, not yet," admitted the hungry tiger, rolling his eyes mournfully at the little girl. "Not yet. Have a cabbage," quavered Carter, waving toward the overturned vegetable cart. "Have a cauliflower or a nice bunch of beets." The hungry tiger was a perfect stranger to him, and Carter could not feel the same confidence in the beast that Betsy seemed to feel. "More vegetables," groaned the tiger, sniffing the air sadly. "Well, I suppose they are better than nothing. But tell me, Betsy, how in Oz did you ever get here, and who?" He blinked rapidly at the strange figure of Carter Green. "Who is this person?" With a little chuckle, Betsy introduced the vegetable man. Then, as quickly as she could, told of their amazing adventures with the winding road and quick sandals, and of Carter's unfortunate experience in the Pasha's garden. "Isn't there some way out of here?" asked the little girl, looking around nervously. "Oh, what's that?" A dismal wail issuing from the stones beneath her feet made Betsy leap into the air. "It's that singer again," growled the hungry tiger, and lashing his tail a little, he put his nose close to the crevice in the blocks. "Less noise down there," he roared warningly. "I always sing when I'm hungry," answered the singer. "Oh, I'm so hungry." "Hand me a tomato or something," rumbled the hungry tiger. "Quick!" The vegetable man made haste to obey, bringing several tomatoes and a dozen apples as well. Looking up at the wall to see that he was not observed, the hungry tiger pushed them hurriedly through the crevice. As the last apple disappeared, a moist song punctuated with sobs came sighing upward. "Oh, beautiful tiger, I love you so, to you, sniff snuffle, my life I owe. And I'll devote it to songs of praise and sing sniff sniff to you all of my days." "Mercy," gasped Betsy Bobbin. The hungry tiger was so embarrassed by the sad singer's ditty that, for a few minutes, he couldn't roar a word. Then, as Carter and Betsy continued to look at him inquiringly, he explained how he had hidden the Rash singer instead of eating him. "See?" cried Betsy, turning proudly to the vegetable man. "I told you he wouldn't hurt anyone. I think you're just the dearest, splendidest tiger I ever—" "Shh!" cautioned the hungry tiger. "Here comes another prisoner. Quick now, pretend you're afraid of me." Betsy and the vegetable man had just time to crouch back against the wall when the guards dropped another rasher into the courtyard. "It's a barber," whispered Betsy in an interested voice, and she was right, for clutched in one hand the prisoner had a mug full of suds and in the other a gleaming razor. "What frightful luck," moaned the hungry tiger. If it had only been a bandit or a robber, I could have eaten him without a qualm, but a barber. Ugh, he smells of bay rum. Stop that racket, fellow, and let me think. And certainly the poor tiger had plenty to occupy his thoughts, for if things went on in this fashion, the underground cavern would soon be full, and then what would happen? And how ever was he to get little Betsy Bobbins safely back to Oz? Paying no attention to the terrified squeals of the barber, the hungry tiger began to pace restlessly up and down the courtyard, till Betsy, feeling sorry for the frightened little man, ran out and assured him he was in no danger of being eaten. It was a long time before the barber stopped shivering, but at last, thoroughly convinced, he hurried impetuously after the tiger. "Let me trim your beautiful whiskers," he begged tremulously. "Trim mine," invited Carter as the hungry tiger impatiently shook his head. The vegetable man's root-like beard had sprouted a foot since morning. So, trembling with relief and gratitude, the rash barber stood upon the edge of the tub and trimmed it most skillfully, trying at the same time to bring Carter's celery-top hair into some kind of order. When the vegetable man, in answer to the barber's questions, had told a bit about himself and Betsy, the barber related how he had accidentally cut the cheek of Irashi while shaving him. "Just a tiny scratch," explained the barber, "and for that I was condemned to die." "But why do you have such a bad king?" exclaimed Betsy impatiently. "Why don't you put him out and elect another?" "We've tried," sighed the barber dolefully, "but Irashi has the army in his power, and with Ipti's help has outwitted us every time." "Is Ipti the fellow with the fountain pen finger?" asked Betsy curiously. "Ooh!" the barber nodded. "He has a handful of odd fingers," he continued despondently. "A pencil, a sealing-wax finger, an eraser, a candle thumb, and a penknife besides. Oh, he's a handy rogue for a fellow like Irashi, but the real ruler of Rash is Asha, the brother of the present Pasha." Weary of the cares of state, he retired to an unknown country to study radio, leaving his small son and Fizzenpop to govern the kingdom. No sooner had he gone than Irashi seized the throne and hid the little prince away. "Until we find the lost prince, nothing can be done," finished the rash barber sorrowfully. "Well, I'll tell Ozma on him," declared Betsy determinedly, "just as soon as I get back to the Emerald City." "Do you think we ever will get back?" The hungry tiger paused in his restless walk and regarded the little group mournfully. "I've been here 2 days and there's not a chink anywhere in this wall." "Let's all look," proposed Betsy, jumping up, and encouraged by her cheerfulness, the 4 prisoners made a careful tour of the pink courtyard. But after several hours had been spent in an unsuccessful search, even Betsy grew downhearted. "Shall we have something to eat?" asked the little girl as they all dropped down wearily beside the hungry tiger's water tub. "It's a good thing they threw that cart over. At least we won't starve." Insisting that this was his part of the performance, Carter passed round tomatoes and apples till everyone felt refreshed. Even the hungry tiger, after swallowing several dozen of each, admitted that he felt a little less hollow.